Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Laurie Johnson. How are you doing, Dr. Laurie Johnson?
I'm okay. I'm over my jet lag. I've been here for a week. I got back from Berlin recently, giving a talk over there. So yeah, now I feel pretty good.
Oh, that's great. So I met you through the Catholic Worker Farm here in Kansas City. And we also have this friend in common who's one of your former students, you know, and some people with Simple also know Amanda Stevie or Amanda Pence. And Dr. Laurie is a professor of political science at Kansas State, major, research institution. Dr. Laurie, we're going to talk to you about converting to Catholicism, being a professor in a secular environment as a Catholic. And I also want to talk to you about what your work with your research, your work on the New Right, your work with the Maurin Academy and the Catholic Worker Farm. Then I have some personal questions I want to ask you about politics.
Sounds good.
Okay. So you are a convert. How did that happen?
So I've been a Christian my whole life. I was raised first as a Methodist, and then my family became Presbyterians. My dad all along the way was kind of like, more like a rationalist deist type of Protestant. And so there was this intellectual element that always kind of played into Christianity for me as I was growing up. But I met my now ex-husband sometime in the early 90s. We were married by 93, and somewhere along the way before we got married, I converted to Lutheranism because he was a Lutheran. Also, it was like a revelation going to the Lutheran Church and experiencing liturgy for the first time and more reverence to communion and just, the liturgy was just amazing to me. I could see right away that opened your ability to actually worship God instead of thinking about what comes next. It gives you this framework where you can just get down to, worshiping and contemplating God. So I really appreciated Lutheranism. But then after my son was born, about 3 or 4 years after he was born, so that would be about 95 or 96, Tim and I both, or my ex-husband and I both, converted to Catholicism. And I sort of led that a little bit, but we both agreed. And the reason why was because, for many people may know, Lutheranism is kind of a short step from Catholicism in some ways, because it keeps a lot of the Catholic practices, right? But the main reason really was practical, which is that both he and I were kind of tired of all the wrangling that Protestants do in their churches over sexual morality issues. For the last decade before our conversion, we'd been in one row after another about, should gay people be able to be ministers, or just various things like this. And we were tired of it because, regardless of what our position was, on that issue, there's more to Christianity than those issues. And we felt like maybe there was some wisdom in taking those issues off the plate. In other words, that part of the attraction to Catholicism was literally that the church had already decided on some of those things, and that it wasn't up to the lay people to decide. So even if we disagreed on some elements of Catholic teaching, at least we weren't going to argue about it, right? We could disagree without feeling that it was our responsibility to somehow adjudicate it.
When you became Catholic, did you find that idea the Catholic Church was true, or did you feel like you just entered a new realm of different little parties within the church?
Both, quickly I realized that there is the thing called the church. And that's what I've tried to cling to over the years, right? That is this source of knowledge and authority and kind of, for me, some peace of mind. And the fact that in America, and I kind of attribute this to the American culture, we do have these little, all these little groups within Catholicism with the lay people who are more or less, in my view, Protestants, right? but they don't want to admit it, right? They disagree with the church about all sorts of things. They try to basically have it their way. And I just have tried to steer clear of that. Again, realizing like I'm not in 100% lockstep with the church teaching, but I don't see the point. I don't think it's productive to like splinter off and argue about things constantly.
When you say you're not in 100% lockstep, does that mean like, by the way, when you said little Protestant groups, were you referring to kind of like liberal objections to the church teaching, or were you kind of saying that about the liberal and the conservative critiques of like when you meet conservatives who are all complaining about the church?
Oh, totally both. Yeah,
Both,
like
great.
here in Manhattan, we definitely met a lot of very conservative Catholics who didn't believe that our current pope was actually the correct
Sure.
one, and who thought that the mass ought to be in Latin and stuff like that. And of course, there are the very liberal ones as well who disagree with the moral teachings of the church and want to make a lot out of that as well. So I would say both, and I just try to ignore that.
Let me ask you two questions about Lutheranism, and then I'm going to follow up with this Catholicism idea. In Lutheranism, isn't there like a Missouri Synod and like some other group of Lutherans? Which group were you with?
We were both. We went from the ELCA, which the Evangelical Church, Lutheran Church of America, to the Missouri Synod on our way to Catholicism. And the issue with the Missouri Synod was, once we got there, it was like, oh my gosh, we've entered the realm of pure absurdity, because these people were arguing about whether you should sing like all 4 stanzas of the hymn. And some were like splintering off into like home churches because they wanted to do it the right way. And at that point, we were just, this is crazy. So it helped push us into Catholicism.
And my other question that I've been wondering is, do you think if Martin Luther was alive today that he would be Catholic?
I think Martin Luther never really intended for what happened to happen. He was a reformer who was trying to really address the church and get the church to see that some of its practices were corrupt. And, when he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, I don't think he intended on there being like this split. But along the way, he hardened his positions, and then future reformers hardened their positions. But I guess that's an interesting question. If he were alive today and he could see the splintering and all of the time that's been wasted on, argumentation, not to mention the religious wars that were, perpetrated by Protestants, he would probably have to admit that Protestants have been no better at some of these things than Catholics. And maybe he tried to be a little bit more patient with the church. But I don't think he had any idea of what he was starting, if that makes sense.
Right. So when you said that you may not agree with the church on everything, are you referring to like the magisterium or the catechism, or are you referring to just the way the church is run day to day? Or it seems like you value the church having a stance that doesn't need publicly debated.
Yeah, I do. And yet there's some things I disagree with it on. It's fairly specific things. So it's not the magisterium, but nevertheless, I guess one that I can mention is I think that the church needs to have a different stance on birth control and realize that there are differences amongst methods of birth control, rather than holding to the strong stance that there is no legitimate form of birth control other than the rhythm method. Because in this country, probably 99% of Catholics therefore ignore the church position. And the church position on it is really quite smart. It's really very knowledgeable about what, it's one of those ingredients that's led to the culture of death, where we think that we can just sort of manipulate life, right? And we can do what we want when we want and have everything our way. So the critique of the mentality of birth control is really well worth learning about. But when you say in 2023, you have to practice the rhythm method. You're just asking for people to just not do it.
So I know my listeners are going to really want me to call you out on calling it the rhythm method and not natural family planning.
Okay, fine.
Being that there is maybe a real distinction that the Creighton method and things like that are not what we used to make what's often made fun of as the rhythm method. But
I use the rhythm method to get pregnant, so I know it works when you do it right.
Okay. Well, let's not go too far down that road, but I'm curious about that. Yeah, I'm meeting a group of Catholics now who don't even think that natural family planning is valid. They think that any attempt to limit the fertility is not optimal.
Yeah,
you know?
Well, I mean, when you think about it, they have a point that kind of maybe reveals the weakness in the church's position on it, because you can use all sorts of scientific methods to figure out when you're fertile and when you're not fertile. And so science enters into the process no matter what. So what is the difference between, natural family planning with the use of scientific methods and other scientific methods of completely precluding fertilization? But I would just say that, that basically means that we need to have a more nuanced position.
Right. When Laura hears this episode, she may make you come back on to talk about this. But
no.
Let's pass it over now.
Okay.
I don't feel ready to get into that. All right. So early on, so you are a Catholic convert professor at a state school,
Yeah.
right? Have you found difficulty in that? Has that ever been an issue?
Not really. I mean, when I first converted, there were already like almost 50% of our faculty was Catholic. So certainly there was no real big deal for me to be a Catholic within my faculty. As far as like beyond my department, there were some friends that I had that were just adamantly like both anti-religion and specifically anti-Catholic, because they thought that Catholics kind of are like religious plus in their view, and they just didn't understand why anybody would believe any of this. And I got pretty, like, I guess, unpolitely razzed about this from some of the people that I knew in other departments, and I did have to let a couple of friendships go. But I didn't have any like pushback of an institutional nature, and I don't now. So it really is not bad. Of course, the assumption is that your Catholicism is your private business. It's not supposed to enter into your workplace.
Do you think, though, that someone who, say, was starting out on an academic career right now, who was against abortion, had maybe the church's views on the trans issues and things like this, had every unpopular Catholic view, do you think that they would have a lot of trouble going into academia and political science?
I think it would matter whether they were extremely public about those views or not. Frankly, I mean, that's the honest answer. That is, if there was a candidate for the job that was highly qualified, and in my field, that might mean having 5, 6, 7 publications before you even apply for a job.
Wow.
And they show a lot of promise, right? And they're not making a huge public deal out of some of those positions, then I don't think it would matter. But it might matter if they were making a huge public deal out of that.
Or if their publications were about those positions.
Yeah, that might be a little bit of a problem, because it wouldn't fit in with the framework of what maybe like legitimate research was at a public institution. And the reaction might be, well, if you want to do that kind of research, maybe you should be at a Catholic institution, because there's this sort of liberal divide, right, in public institutions that says that your religion is your business, but you should keep it private, right? And not bring it into this public domain where it can cause controversy. So there might be, I mean, I don't know for sure, but there might be some like heartburn for that type of person. Yeah, we have had people in the department, including myself, who hold some of those types of views, but I'm not particularly strident about them personally, and that's the honest truth. And so it doesn't cause me trouble.
Do you think that I have been discouraging people from going into academia for years now, partly just because I think there's way too many PhDs printed with few to no positions to have with those degrees, right? Do you feel like it's harder to get into academia now than, say, when you did it?
Yeah, it is. It's harder because there's fewer positions, and there's a trend in universities to backfill with adjuncts and with temporaries and non-tenure track people, so that, a lot of universities are trying to keep things going by hiring people but not giving them tenure. And why would you get a PhD and go potentially into debt, or at least spend like 6 to 7 years of your life getting training so that you can get paid, $45,000 a year with no job security, right? So like, I think that we're heading towards a really a sort of end of this system as we know it. I mean, it's going to take a while, but the economic trends and the political trends are very much against this sort of lifetime tenured job, which I think is essential for like professors to have intellectual freedom. And so, like, one of the things that we're seeing is there's less intellectual freedom at universities every year because tenure is going away, and what does exist is not being taken seriously. It's being violated.
So what do you think about, like, I've often, probably the time I started paying attention to things was the 90s, and I've always felt like there were these people who were public intellectuals who were not in academia. And some of them like were in both academia and not in academia. Like I'm thinking like Camille Paglia is someone who I remember a lot of people talking about. She was not respected because she was in academia. She was respected because she was exciting, because she had interesting ideas. I feel like there were some libertarian thinkers who kind of were in this realm of public intellectual also. My sense is that today in 2023, that the public intellectual sphere has gotten a lot bigger. That a lot of them aren't professors, yeah. That people are able to, in a sense, make a living in the world of ideas without going into academia. Does that way it feels to you or not?
You're right that there's more public intellectuals. There's more people willing to come out there. Part of that is just because technologically it's so easy to do, right? Like you don't have to have some publisher or some media person your engagement. You can just go ahead and do it yourself and then see if you get traction. And I think this has all been really good. I think it's been good for the public to the extent that they engage it. We have to remember that most of the public, the vast majority of the public, does not engage at any level of this stuff that public intellectuals do. So we have to keep that in mind. But most of them are not close to making a living doing it. So it's a side hustle. It's, I would bet even some of the most prominent ones, right, are not primarily making their living from their media income. They might be making it from other things like speaking engagements or, merchandise or, other aspects that roll off of that. But like, it's easier for me to try to get into this public arena because I have a job basically already,
Can we tell people your podcast? I think you have two, right?
Yeah. One of my podcasts is Political Philosophy, which is just it's a audio version of my YouTube channel. So you can get that content either by looking at Political Philosophy, the YouTube channel, which they Google like Political Philosophy, Dr. Laurie Johnson. And then we have another podcast through the Maurin Academy called Dust Bowl Diatribes. And I do that with Spencer Hess, who's one of the two people that are running the JPII farm in Kansas City.
And who's been on our podcast. If anybody wants to meet Spencer, it's a couple podcasts ago. Spencer and Emily.
It was a great podcast.
Now, while listening to some of your content, somewhere I picked up that your early work in political science was critiquing classical liberalism. Is that right?
Yeah, like up until fairly recently, really. I've written two books on Hobbes, then one on Locke and Rousseau, and one on Tocqueville and Democracy in America. And all of them have taken on the development of liberal theory and its flaws. Hobbes is kind of the first proto-liberal thinker. He's a social contract thinker. And then, Locke is kind of like the quintessential classical liberal thinker. Rousseau is somebody who's somewhat on the fence, as he's an Enlightenment thinker, but he's also kind of romantic, and he can see some of the dangers of, classical liberal, the bourgeois mentality. And then with Tocqueville, you get a look at what does a French aristocratic thinker think about American bourgeois liberalism? And, that helps me to contemplate what it is about America. And through all these different books, I looked at this through the lens of honor, which is the same headspace that religion occupies in people's minds. It's a motivation to do something that isn't about just your self-interest or fear. But, starting with Hobbes in the liberal tradition, you get this argument that the honor and religion are the two sources of conflict in the world. And this is such a problem that we have to eliminate the honor motivation, and we have to privatize religion or keep it under our dominion, or both, in order to stop them from having this inflammatory effect that causes people to kill each other over what Hobbes and Locke and other liberal thinkers tend to think is trivialities, things of no consequence, or things of personal choice. So by tracing their response to honor, you can also, and I do have chapters in most of those books on those thinkers' take on the Christian religion too, because they basically demolish it. So, one of the things that the Maurin Academy tries to teach is there is no real compatibility between liberal theory and strong Christianity.
Are you critiquing this in the sense of hey, it's incompatible with the but religion's true because we're Catholic, right? And therefore liberalism is, needs rejected? Or are you actually pushing towards a modified liberalism? You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, I do know what you're saying. I don't know if I have an answer. It's pretty easy to show that liberalism is incompatible with Christianity, even though there's a whole industry trying to prove otherwise. Right? That's what Christian nationalism is about. That's what John Courtney Murray and those people in the Catholic tradition is about. But I do agree with David Schindler that there is this just inherent incompatibility. And if you look at the liberal theorists, they work really hard to trivialize and sort of relativize people's religious faith. This isn't a hard, insight to gain if you really read them carefully. So we have to kind of admit that. Now, can there be some compromise with liberalism? This is the system that we have right now. I don't think politically there can, but you can live within the liberal system and do what you can do within it, and you don't have to completely conform to the expectations of our society. It's difficult.
Let me ask a question related to this. So when I was most interested in kind of libertarian thought, I was meeting a lot of classical liberal, just people who very much thought in terms of the non-aggression principle and property rights is almost like a moral absolute. They weren't arguing for them from a pragmatic perspective. They were arguing for them from a no, this is just what right and wrong is, right? And at the same time, they were atheist, right? And I remember thinking, I don't see how you can have any ground for some universal right and wrong if all we are is just an evolved species that came up with a way to organize ourselves. You know what I mean? I feel like you almost need some God in order to have this universal absolute right and wrong. And when I would push them on this, they would point me out to Locke, right? And I didn't read a lot of Locke, but I picked up the first book, and he's proving all his points by citing scripture, which made me think this man has not given up on the Christian God. in a sense, right? Like he's trying to make all his points and prove it to everyone by finding them in Scripture, right? So he wasn't a good source for a universal right and wrong independent of God. So help kind of like clear up my confusion on that, because that was my experience with Locke.
Okay, I'll try. Both Hobbes and Locke cite the Bible continuously throughout their books. Hobbes is arguably an atheist. His presumptions about God are so scientific that he argues God out of existence and twists the Bible to show that, you can still be a Christian and believe that God is some sort of physical entity that must exist in space and time, because nothing that is immaterial exists. Okay, so it's a pretty wild ride. If you read all of Hobbes' Leviathan, even the part on Christianity, he tries really hard. He knows the Bible. They all did back then. It was a central text for anybody who was learned knew about it. So, he tries hard to basically conform the Bible to his materialism. It's a very extreme, radical materialism that just precludes a great deal of what you and I no doubt would agree that we believe in. And then Locke is a little bit softer on this, but in his letters concerning toleration, the argument that he uses basically makes almost every religious principle a matter of, quote, indifference. It is just, when it comes right down to it, maybe reason tells us that, there's a first mover and God exists because things exist in the world. But as far as exactly what we should believe and how we should worship and so forth, that's matter of indifference. The only reason why he said we shouldn't tolerate atheists, he said, because you can't trust any of their oaths because they're not fearful of something to keep them in check. You can't trust Catholics and Muslims, according to Locke, because they have dual citizenship. They have two sovereigns, and you can't have two sovereigns. You can only have one. You can't have an imam or a pope, or else you can't be the good liberal citizen that you ought to be. So if you really, look at Locke's logic regarding Christianity, even though he cites the Bible, his Christianity is either non-existent or very, very different than what ordinary Christians would believe. So
do you think they're kind of just proof texting for the sake of propaganda to convince someone who believes differently than them, like to try to get a religious person to come to their side? Or do you think it was important in their mind to have these proof texts? They knew that they had to tackle it somehow. And I think that they were hoping that people, when it comes to texts like this, different people will see different things. That's part of the beauty of it, right? So for the person who really wants to see Locke as a believing Christian, they can walk away and say, yes, he is. And it's okay, right? For people who want to, sort of delve a little deeper, they might find a different truth there. So I think that both of those fellows were worried about persecution if they were to take openly strident atheist views. But I think they were also concerned that most of their society was Christian. And so they had to address it, right? But they had to address it on their own terms. And I don't think it bothered them if people walked away thinking that they were still Christians. But nevertheless, their rationale is incompatible with an actual faith. I'd like to now kind of introduce this other topic that you're on. I think at the end, you're going to have to counsel me on my own political thought, and it might come back to this classical liberal issue. But you've also written a lot on the new right. Yeah. And let me venture a definition of what the new right is, and you correct it, or if it's not what you meant by it. But it's kind of like this new energy on the right that's not the historical Republican energy, but maybe starts around maybe right before Donald Trump, kind of from that Breitbart type stuff that's going on, and is now, I'd say, many different things, many different kind of people with ideas within that movement. But it's all kind of this energy on the right that's not the historical kind of Republican energy. And they'll critique the historical Republicans as merely liberals doing the speed limit. Is that
Yeah.
about right?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to remember that it probably really started back earlier, maybe even as early as the 60s and 70s, as far as like the seeds of it developing. Even with like, I don't know if you're familiar with Rush Limbaugh, but when the Rush Limbaugh show came on the air and it was so popular, he spent a lot of time kind of hammering at the more like establishment Republicans. And now he was a classical liberal thinker economically, but he was much more about kind of what we would now call nationalism, patriotism, what it means to be an American. And I think he was very much against the elites. And there's a big strain amongst the new right that's anti-elitist, right? That sees both, mainly like liberal elites in the media and in government and the deep state and so on. So I think some of the seeds were planted back then. But you're right that like closer to now, within the past decade or so, I think it's got to do with the ramping up of globalization, right? I mean, again, globalization's been around a while. Back in the 70s and 80s, we had people on the left and on the right who were like developing paranoia about globalization. Like on the left, people who say things that you might hear from right wing people now about the New World Order. All right. So, but as we move into this new world where globalization is really affecting our national economies in a major way, I think this is why it's become far stronger now. And that's why if you look at Donald Trump's rhetoric, you find him constantly hammering at globalization and at elites, right? In his campaign, in like his announcement speech when he announced his point of running for president, he about half or more of the speech is about your jobs being taken away by globalized corporations who take their jobs overseas and so on, and about elites not understanding the common people. And so, I mean, people focused on his tweets, but if you look at what he actually said in his official speeches, you can see why people were attracted to him.
What I've read from you on this movement is you see it as like, hey, here's a logical place where it comes from. Here's the social factors that feed into it. Mm-hmm. Here's the globalization causes, et cetera, et cetera. And then I guess you have this rise of Donald Trump and like the actual political reality that came about due to these concerns, right?
Yeah.
But then I also see, though, a lot of just people who are fielding interesting ideas, be there like, I mean, there's kind of an anarchist thinker on the new right I follow a little bit. There's this Curtis Yarvin figure out there who's also kind of interesting, who says he's a monarchist. And there's all these like other people in this milieu. What'd you say?
Moldbug.
Moldbug, yes, Mencius Moldbug, right? And to me, it's kind of interesting because I feel like there's a lot of, to me, I don't see cohesion in the movement. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you see it as like this sociological movement that more or less is cohesive? Or are you kind of more where I'm kind of at, where I feel like there's a lot of little micro movements and they're all in this realm of being in the right, like some maybe overtly racist, some very much not racist, or whatever the issue is, that are just that part of the right, which is against, say, the historic status quo right.
I just think we're focusing on two different things. You're focusing kind of on the thought leaders, mm-hmm. and I'm focusing on what causes people to vote for somebody like Donald Trump or like Erdogan or, various right-wing people who gain power. And it's many things, right? And it's many things that make them listen to some folks like that, right? So like when it comes to what gets people to en masse, like vote for somebody that an attempt to change the government, it is these other factors that agitate them enough to the point where they're seeking those types of ideas and want kind of their marching orders. And this is something that you see a lot, right? Is they start to think in terms of more or less conspiracy, right? That there's like things, people and things going on behind the scenes. And it's not that they're not, there's a good grain of truth to a lot of conspiracy theories, but and these things cannot be like tackled in any way other than like some sort of drastic change, right?
So I'm okay with everything you just said, and that I think that's just a different conversation than to actually address all these different thinkers that are running around there, you know?
Some of them are interesting, I grant you, and some of them are quite reasonable, you know, and like some of the new right thinkers, I don't know, like even Alexander Dugin, the Russian, Alain de Benoit, French new right thinker, who was co-founder or one of the founders of the Nouvelle Droite, the New Right in France. They're interesting to read, and they're pretty smart, and they make some really good points. If everybody was kind of like on board with these sophisticated ideas, we wouldn't have like political problems. We could have political arguments that could be solved. But that's not the case, right? In any sort of mass movement, in what ordinary people do, they don't follow those arguments and they don't listen to the reasonableness of intellectuals.
Well, let's talk about it in the way that you're talking about it, as like kind of the sociological political movement. Do you see any good that could come from it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, right? Like, I think that this is a huge missed opportunity for the Democratic Party or for reasonable Republicans and other leaders to actually harness the energy of people who are dissatisfied with their conditions of life and address those, you know, the concerns that they have. You know, I mean, many of the people who supported Donald Trump and are still very angry are victims of the decimated rural environment that we have, where, you know, nobody can make a living on their farm anymore unless they own like thousands of acres, and there's no rural life to speak of anymore, you know. So I think that it's this huge opportunity where people are really expressing their dissatisfaction. It may be a really blunt edged instrument, but you know, if I were Democrats, for instance, I would have done very differently with this insight than they have done, right? Which is basically to call these people stupid and to not take any ownership of the problems that have caused this. I mean, I'm speaking broadly, but you know, I'm really frustrated with that. And then Republicans just seem to be opportunists taking it for a ride without really addressing the problems that have caused it.
I feel like addressing the problems that caused it is almost politically impossible.
If that's the case, then we shouldn't have a democracy anymore.
I'm worried about that.
Yeah, I am too. But like, we could be, you know, not that long ago, we did, you know, regulate the economy more. We did protect our industries to a certain extent. We did have programs that supported smaller businesses and smaller farms strong enough that they could be protected. I mean, the Maurin Academy is interested in distributism for this reason. You know, like, in fact, I was just told by somebody from Canada today, she thinks it might get more traction in Canada because it's got a different culture than here. She thought some of those policies might be possible. We haven't broken up a monopoly since AT&T. We have laws on the books to break up monopolies. We could be doing some things that we're not doing.
But like, for example, like this, like supporting a small farmer, like just one single issue, you know, not anything else, reforming anything else in our society. I don't see an interest that it'd be powerful enough to support that, yet I see interest powerful enough to defeat that.
Exactly.
You know?
Well, big money has taken over our political system.
And that's where my fear comes from. I've kind of been following the rise of this RFK Jr. guy, and he's interesting. And I try to imagine what it would be like if he was elected. And I imagine he would take on a few major federal agencies and make some meaningful reform. Probably the USDA, the CDC, the EPA. Those seem to be his most interest areas, right? And then but then somebody asked me to compare that to Trump, and Trump is kind of giving the voice of, hey, I'll take it all on, you know, and it seems like that seems impossible. It seems like even RFK trying to reform three major institutions seems nearly impossible, you know, let alone taking it all on.
I think they're just riding the crest of the wave. I don't think they're serious. Donald Trump didn't do very much.
I agree with Donald Trump. I don't know if RFK is serious or not, but you're right on that.
I don't know much about him. I think a lot of people that end up like RFK get a little bit squirrely, for want of a better word, and that makes it hard for me to like take him too seriously. I have heard a little bit about him, but on the other hand, like if they were actually serious instead of just wanting to get elected, maybe some things could happen. But I'd like to see it.
But do you see any movement that, in your words, is actually serious?
No. No, I'm sorry, I can't help you out there. Not in this country.
Sorry.
Not in this country. I mean, we are in a real syndrome right now, which is why so many people are starting to talk about what can we do without working through the government system, without working through the political system, which is a very sad state of affairs, when people kind of give up on it and ask that question. But as of now, I mean, we're in such a deadlock between these two parties. We don't have a parliamentary system which encourages third parties and compromise. You know, that's why the new right has kind of taken over the Republican Party, is because there's not a system in which they could have their own legitimate party and then negotiate. But that's not the system that we have, and I don't know. I don't see a lot of.
What is the work that you're doing with the Maurin Academy with Spencer, and who else is involved in that? And like, what is your goals with that? Is that an effort to help in some way?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be a case of withdrawing, right? Like, we're not trying to change the political system. We're not trying to change the overall economic system. We are trying to create something good within the context that we have and hope that we can do it without being harassed too much. And we hope that we can create a model that might be replicable down the road when things get worse, if they do, due to climate change and economic and political issues, right? So, like, you can find these types of organizations everywhere in this country that are doing things in a different way they're not viable right now as like something to take on as larger, replicable way of living, but they could be if times changed.
So like if you're in like the technology space and you have a new app, you talk about things like virality and whether or not, what is the hook on this app and how will it propagate, right? When I see efforts that are kind of small time efforts to live a different way, I don't see effort put into thinking about that, like virality, that spread idea, they're just like, hey, we think this is better. Like when you say that some days these may become very popular, I'm like, well, what's the plan? Like no one would fund a business if they just said, this is a better way. Someday it'll be popular.
Well, I think it's going to be popular when conditions change, if that makes sense. Just as before, people did more of this type of activity because they needed to, right? Back in my dad's 96, and when he was growing up, people lived under the same roof together. They tended to take in their relatives. People involved in churches like helped each other out. They helped each other with harvests. They made sure Aunt, Lizzie didn't just die alone. They cooperated. They grew things. Everybody had a garden, et cetera, et cetera. Why did they do that? Because they had to, because the situation was such that it made sense. We are currently not living in that situation, but that's not to say that we won't someday. And it looks like the indicators are we will someday.
Now, there are parts of the world, though, that like are kind of in that situation. Like we had a mission in Nicaragua and they don't have old folks' homes and they don't have this, right? Yet when I look at what they're doing to sustain, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look like a model that I would wish that we would have here,
I think it depends on where you look. I don't know Latin America all that well, but we do have a Latin Americanist in our in the Maurin Academy who tells me that like village life is still alive and well in certain parts of Latin America where the I guess the outside economy hasn't come so far in or had such an impact that people haven't lost the traditions. I mean, part of what you're talking about is like once people lose those traditions and habits and skills, frankly, it's a lot of skills. It's not easy to get them back. So there are areas where they still have those traditions, habits, and skills, and they still function. And then there's areas that are breaking down in the developing world where there's enough of the other way of life coming in that people are losing those traditions and habits and skills. And then it's very difficult to go back. And in our society, we're all the way on the other end of that. And so when traditionalists say, well, you just need to get morality and you need to know, you need to love your family and you need to, like figure out how to help other people, you're really asking for a lot, right? Because there's no like memory, there's no like habituation, there's no like buy-in at the level of like traditions and cycles of life, you know? So you'd have to recreate it, which right there means a sort of artificiality that people who are still living in a more traditional environment don't even know about. They haven't experienced that idea that, oh, we choose whether to take care of grandma or not. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I'm trying to wrap my head around it a little bit. Let me ask you this though, and maybe we'll keep exploring this idea a little bit. So the Maurin Academy is kind of with your people who work with the Maurin Academy, is kind of an idea workshop, right?
yeah.
And I read something you were writing about that, where it's like the Maurin Academy is the idea workshop. It's named after Peter Maurin, if anyone wants to know, who's one of the founders of the Catholic Worker movement.
Right.
And then the Catholic Worker Farm that Spencer and Emily are running is the laboratory for those ideas. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, at least some of them. I don't know about all of them, but yes, it's kind of a real life experiment in, whether people can cooperate under what circumstances.
And you're seeing this, like I was talking to a guy today who he's had to restore this like really old building. And through the process of, working on the building, we were just talking about the stones on the building, and none of the stonemasons he hired could properly set them because they were always setting them in concrete. And it caused all these problems because concrete expands differently than the stone. It was cracking all the stones, and you had to use this lime mortar, which had the same expansion coefficients as the limestone, And while talking, we were talking about how there's like this group of tradesmen that built these beautiful old buildings that are just no longer with us, and they aren't around to make YouTube videos on how to do it. Right. There's like a great knowledge loss in America, I think, about making things, like even the manufacturing knowledge loss. Right. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that this like Catholic Worker Farm is partly about recreating that lost knowledge as it pertains to agriculture, gardening, etc.? Or do you feel like it's more about this, like, how do we reinstill new family values and taking care of the elderly, et cetera? Like, is it more like a laboratory of like culture, or more a laboratory of like, hey, here's the survival skills you're going to need to have if global warming gets really bad,
I think it's both, because you can't, one without the other, you can't really get by in anything but the type of circumstances that we have, so I can buy, whatever I want in the way of food as well as care. I can buy lawn care. If I get, handicapped, I can get the assistance I need. It's, it's all kind of wrapped up together. If I need assistance, other circumstances, I need people, right? I need relationships and community. So I don't really see the two as separable. I also need people around me who know how to get things done and how to grow food and supply themselves. Like those aren't two different groups, and they usually would end up going together, right? Like you would need both of those things. You would need people cooperating to like provide whatever it was they did need, and definitely food would be one of those things. So, and I guess the way, in a nutshell, I think all of us can agree that when we look out into the future, like when I look at like, what's life going to be like when my son is 50? Right now he's 25. Okay. Well, he might be living in a world where both of those things are needed. And the only way he's going to get them might be if he knows how to develop relationships with people and learn skills and be adaptable. That's what we're looking at. That's the future that we're looking at. Now, if we're wrong, well, maybe we'll be happy about that. Maybe it'd be nice to be proven wrong, but I think maybe our future might not be as cushy and plush as it is now, you know? And so we need to provide the framework for how to handle that. Like even if we went into another Great Recession or Depression, already we have tons of people around, this, like Simple House knows this, that are like just completely like unable to care for themselves and resistant to cooperating because they're victimized by the society and the economic system that we have. It's impossible for them probably to ever get to where we're talking about that level of cooperation, which is sad, but moving forward, all we can think to do is try to figure out what kind of framework might work, and how to adjust it to where like people coming out of a system that's pretty liberal and pretty individualistic and private and so on, how they could possibly deal with cooperating with others. Because we're not talking about the way people were back when my dad was a kid. They're different now. And the level of like togetherness that might be required might be pretty hard for most people to take. So how do you do it, in a way that would work?
I kind of have a different view that I'll just share my thought right off. It's like when you compare the Great Recession to the Great Depression, one of the big differences I see is just how wealthy we are.
Sure.
Like that the level of suffering in the Great Recession was almost like a psychological suffering more than a physical suffering compared to the Great Depression.
But you're assuming that that's going to go on forever, and nothing goes on forever. I mean, look at the history of the rise and fall of civilizations. We're not an exception. They all decline. And so, I mean, whether it's like rapid or whether it's slow, this can't go on forever. And we do have like climate change in the mix here, and it really is causing us trouble. It is going to change who lives where, what can be grown where, what can be produced where. I think we're looking at some disruptions moving forward.
So I was kind of going somewhere else with that. I think I'm saying that, let's call it culture. And what I mean by that is like robust families, the ability to take care of one another, the necessity of spending a lot of time and living much more intensely with each other. Right.
Yeah.
I am someone who like grew up in a way that we did not spend a lot of time together. We didn't live that intensely. Like if my family, I say this with all respect to my family, and my family knows, we all kind of think this is true. We would like have a really nice dinner together and then all go to our rooms and hang out doing whatever for the rest of the evening. And we'd think that was like living in community, right? Whereas like I've seen Catholic families and experience this where it's much more like, no, you have the dinner together and then you continue to be together for the next 3-4 hours, right? And it's taken a lot for me to kind of learn that, not having like, that wasn't our norm, and I see that as you're kind of talking about that as that's going to be necessary for survival at some level, or that's kind of the future in that way, right? I feel like that's also like, even if the survival isn't an issue, even if all future recessions look a lot more like the Great Recession, that's necessary for living a rich life.
It totally is.
And we're seeing like suicide just kind of, it feels like go off the charts. Like if I knew as many people who died of a certain type of cancer as I know who've died of suicide, I would be so alarmed about that cancer. I'd be like reading about it every day, how to avoid it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I agree with all that.
Yeah. So anyway, it's just interesting. I guess I have the same idea that this like community and cultural healing needs to happen. regardless of what happens to us civilization and economically. Even if prosperity does go on for another however long.
And I guess what I'm saying, I agree with you. I think we need it. I think life is much more interesting and exciting with it and meaningful. And I'm not sure why it's so hard, but I've just come to accept that people aren't going to do it unless they're forced to. So we can try to find some sort of way to make this viral, but it's not going to work. That's my belief. Is I don't think there's a way you can talk people into it. There's a lot of people who've been trying to talk people into that for centuries, actually, but definitely, in the past century, it's not just us, and people have heard those arguments repeatedly. But when it comes right down to it, if you've got a room to go to, you're going to go to that room. And that's just the God's honest truth. So in my view, all we can really do is, and now some people are attracted to this way of life. Great, let them come, but I don't think there's any way that we can surmount that obstacle.
Yeah, I guess I'm not, as a Christian, I always view my duty as to like the people immediately surrounding me, not as like how to fix society, And
Yeah.
I see how my parish can be more intentional. I see how my nuclear family, and I can give my kids the heritage of it. Right. And I see it actually happening. I don't see it taking off in all society, curing the loneliness that everyone's feeling, but I do see it, at the local level,
Mm-hmm.
and and I almost feel like that is my call, is to do that, it almost like managing society seems like it's a task above the pay grade,
Yeah. It really is, but what you can do is attract the people who are kind of already seeking and wanting that. And I would say, like, the Catholic Church is I would like to see more and more done through the Catholic Church to foster this type of community beyond the monastery, to like, because we have these examples of monastic life where, people go into them they make these amazing commitments, to devote their lives and to live in a very different way. And then we have the lay people, and we do have like lay apostolates, but there's not a whole lot of people going into those lay apostolates, right? Like, they're an option, but they're a pretty obscure option. But I think there's like room for the lay apostolate idea to grow, and for the church to take a more active role in promoting different and various levels of this kind of thing. Because we're more likely to do that than I think a lot of other types of Christians to do it.
I think you're right. But when I hear you speak about it, it sounds like you're saying like, hey, we have this great community thing going on here, and we need to figure out a way to spread it to the rest of society. And when I look at the church, what I see is that I feel like we made too much of a truce with kind of the modern way of being, and that only now are we healing. And like I remember growing up, just not knowing anyone at my parish. There were thousands of families at the parish. And it wasn't really a cultural center or a center where we were bonding. It was a center where we went to receive sacraments, like almost period. And now I see parishes where we hang out half an hour after Mass. We have a Catholic sports league. We're doing these things almost like we're discovering it internally. What probably was way more common in 1940, we're trying to recreate now, and I guess I'm a little bit, and also, with monasticism, it's like, well, monasticism's largely been dying out, I wish it was working well, that we could just like explode it into the rest of society, but we need to almost save it first, or save our parish first before we go reinvent. It's been my sense.
Yeah, well, I wasn't calling on monasticism to grow necessarily, but just saying that we have this model, and, it is a heritage of the Catholic tradition that Protestants don't have. And why don't we, and we have the lay apostolates, and they are quite, like, you can find them, they're out there. But we don't have a lot in between. I feel like, I don't know much about the lay apostolates, but I've checked into a few of them. And I feel like they are like, if you're a really intense Catholic, and you go to Mass every day and stuff like that, you might be a candidate for the lay apostolate. Okay. But then there's all this stuff in between that people could be doing that's maybe more than just which I agree with you. These are good things, like go to the luncheon, go to the, go to the sports stuff. But like, what's between the intensity of the lay apostolate and that? And is there room for like encouraging Catholics to do a little bit more cooperation with each other that's well short of like monasticism?
Do you, when you say lay apostolate, are you including the Maurin Academy, the Catholic Worker Farm, Simple House, or are you saying some like Opus Dei type lay apostolate?
Yeah. Like, for instance, there's one in, some of them are associated with the orders and some of them are like not, but they tend to be, we're not lay apostolates because they're recognized by the church as.
Okay. That's what you mean by that. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, we might want to be someday, but we would want to be in a more like fixed.
I guess I view things like the Maurin Academy and Simple House as, apostolic work by laity. And therefore I kind of view it as very much, totally. The answer to what you're saying. All right. Can I ask you now about these problems I'm having with political theory?
I'll try. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. And I want you to, I am like not read and not educated on this, and you can feel free when necessary to just straight up correct me on issues. What I see as like the major turning point is like the Industrial Revolution, and I don't see that as like an issue of technology as much as it is an issue of like somehow dispersed activity, like allowing, in a sense, innovation to happen at smaller and smaller levels and planning to happen at a more dispersed level, and somehow that being a big turning point. And I say that to say, like, there was about 1 billion people on the planet by the year 1800, and now there's like 8 billion, right? It took like 1,500 years to get out of the Iron Age, but it took like 150 years to go from the age of sail to like space navigation, And I almost feel like if you took Aristotle or Aquinas or anyone and like took them to today and gave them a decade to get, their feet underneath them, they're going to see that as like the most shocking thing. Not that we fly in space, but that like so much is being organized at such this kind of like, you could call it an anarchistic level, like this like voluntary, that like in their day, it was much more like the big public works were commissioned by the polis or the city state. Right. And now we have just major things happening that are, just companies, and when I see Catholics or anyone try to reinvent what we are in right now, like with this idea of what society should be, I'm like really skeptical, just inherently, because I'm worried that we're going to break this thing that feeds 8 billion people and shelters 8 billion people, almost like let's tinker, let's improve. We have to, or we're not going to make it, but like when you're kind of this whole hog, hey, new vision of the future, I'm like, whoa, hold your horses, and a lot of these ideas, like you have a good recommend your covering of the David Schindler book, Politics of the Real, right? A lot of these ideas are like kind of based on a critique of liberalism. Mm-hmm. In a way, I don't know what to think, because I do think it's those liberal ideas that led to the explosion that is the Industrial Revolution. And I kind of think of it the same way I think of like maybe the same way we were talking earlier about the New Right. Well, there's a lot of thinkers, but then there's the movement, and the thinkers are never really completely the movement. There's just like the movement has, in a sense, a life of its own, and it's not like the people who wrote the Constitution took John Locke and just made it the Lockean Constitution, but they took a lot from him.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm thinking also like, how Sir Isaac Newton is the founder of physics, basically the father of physics, but he's also an alchemist.
Right.
So he's also got nutty stuff that he spent a lot of time on and wrote books on, but he also wrote the stuff that created modern physics, and I feel like a lot of these critiques of these liberal thinkers are like, well, yeah, okay, they were flawed and maybe you were completely right. They are anti-religion, but they also created this situation we're in now. Like something in there had a lot of traction, and maybe they didn't come up with it. Maybe they were just codifying something that was already in the water, but something led to this explosion of civilization that happens at the Industrial Revolution. And like, it seems to me like almost like, well, how about you comment on that? Then I'll talk about my problem with this idea of trying to reinvent it all,
Okay. Yeah, I think maybe in a way you're talking about extremes here. I don't know too many people want to reinvent everything. But I guess to address the Industrial Revolution and the whole point there, you're assuming that we're like really secure right now, whereas there's another way to look at this where globalization has caused such interdependence that we're extremely vulnerable. For instance, Russia has decided it's going to not allow Ukraine to let its grains out to be sold to the world now as a part of that war. And that's like something like 13% of the world's barley supply, 10% of the world's wheat supply. It's going to raise prices. It's going to, anyway.
Even better examples, we now have multiple ways we've created to destroy ourselves. And pre-industrial revolution, we didn't. Like we could be more perilous than ever before.
The liberal economy gives you the sense that you're really secure because you can get something at your grocery store, right? But where did that come from? And if you were thinking kind of just at a practical level, wouldn't you want to know that the food is nearby, right? And not something that relies on supply chains from hundreds, if not thousands of miles, and the economics of other countries that you don't even understand. So we are, the pandemic kind of mildly taught us this lesson, just with ridiculously trivial problems by comparison to what we could be encountering. But, like people couldn't get their toilet paper or their baby formula for a while, right? Now, like, just square and quadruple that problem. And then, so, I mean, from a national security perspective, from a common sense, supply yourself with what you need perspective, it makes sense to protect your own country's industry to a certain extent. It doesn't have to mean complete withdrawal from the global economy, but it has to mean, the notion that economics is also a part of national security. Just like we have to take into account what other countries threaten us with.
I feel like I can agree with everything you're saying. And I even feel like your point's even understated. I mean, like, I feel like we have even more threats than the ones you're pointing out. I mean, like, we saw the pandemic and gain of function research on viruses, and now AI, and there's also nuclear weapons. There's all these things where this whole structure that's supporting 8 billion could disappear and be wiped out. Right. So security is not very good. And everything you said, I could be completely for, like, let's locally source all our agriculture. Let's build redundant systems and robust systems. And that would be a big improvement. I think that's great. I guess I don't know that that's what I'm critiquing. I guess anybody who's advocating for those things, those seem like common sense, don't have any problem. Definitely not for, I think I used to be for this kind of unmitigated free trade idea. And now I see that as a complete problem, Yeah. But my question, though, is much more like these Catholic integralists or thinkers like a distributist even, or Spencer and I have had talks where he has this idea where he wants to reinvent where we shelter, where we get our food, how we spend our time. It is just like, well, hold it. No, like, let's pause for a second, man. But like with the distributist or the Catholic integralist, so by the way, for our listeners, Catholic integralism, let me try to sum it up. You could maybe comment. It's almost like that if, theology and God is all true, it's actually above the state and should be above the state. And in a proper ordering of society, the church, in a sense, would be above the state. And there you go. Is that right?
It's pretty close to it. Yeah.
Pretty close. But I think if Aristotle came back today and had time to like look around, he was a Christian, which we all hope he would be if he was alive today. I think he'd say, wow, I know that the church is the instrument of change in all society. I know that the church is how God's, work and will happens here on earth. And it appears that what the church is an organ that helps breathe truth and life and goodness and beauty and joy into the world, but I don't think he would conclude, and it should run the world, not because that doesn't at some intellectual level sound good, but because it never has, and it never actually has. And if you look at the words of Christ, there's nothing in there that is like a great blueprint for doing it.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be his main point when he arrives in the Roman Empire.
I think I know better what you're saying now. And our position on all of those things is that none of them can work in their purity. So, like, for instance, when Spencer comes up with ideas about how people should live, he's not assuming everybody's going to live that way. But you have to have ideals. You have to have, this is why they make a contribution, whether it's integralists or the opposite, or any other type of idealist thought. You have to have standards and ideals with which to compare the real world, and also to give you ideas about what you could do, knowing full well that in practice you can never achieve those ideals. But if you don't have them and you don't talk about them, then you're just muddling through in whatever world you currently have, and you can't really change it. I mean,
is that real though?
You have to have ideals in your head you literally have to have them in your head in order to propose things like Simple House. So, knowing that Simple House doesn't change the whole world, but you must have in your head this idea that if people all were kind to each other and gave each other shelter and helped each other out and were Christians in that sense, the world would be a better place. But in practice, you can't do everything.
So Simple House, I think your point is fine, and I'll just correct this about Simple House though, but it never was an attempt to change society. It was very much an attempt as personal,
right.
Let's just love the poor and grow in holiness. Kind of the same idea of St. Francis, meaning he wasn't trying to change the world either. He was trying to live radically the gospel, and it's very much only a secondary point whether or not it works. It has to work for you, not for changing society, I guess, right? But having said that, I think what you're saying is valid. But I feel though, if I can say, hey, I want more people to thrive. I want minorities to do better. I want the problem of people living in stressed out fear in this neighborhood to be changed, right? And I can have a value like that and then promote policy actions that I think have a chance at creating that goal, right? I don't see how, I feel it's a dangerous waste when someone goes to an integralist position or even spends time worrying about it, because I feel like there's a couple of dangers there, and please defeat these dangers. But one is that you're not dealing with in a sense, the reality we've been given by God is in fact God's gift to us. And this is kind of so outside the reality in kind of this it's almost like saying, as an economist, you'd say there's all these agents and they have tastes. And then very quickly, the economist doesn't want to talk about taste anymore and just says it's profit motive, but really the economic model would be more interesting if we had more complex thoughts on what the tastes were, going into the model. Right. But there's this idea almost if we could just reinvent everyone's tastes and we could change the way people relate and we could have a different culture and we could do this, then this would happen. Right. And it's why is that a useful thought experiment?
It is the way people are and have been forever, right? So I don't know if we can change that. I guess I want to make it clear I'm not an integralist, by the way.
Right.
I mean, just in case somebody got confused.
Sure.
But I do see the contributions of all of these people of one form of what I would call idealism or the other, is that they make proposals that can then inform us, right? We don't have to take everything they say lock, stock, and barrel and try to, even if they might dream, that it might happen someday. Yes, they're wasting their time to the extent that they really think they can 100% make that happen. Not all of them do, by the way. I think a lot of thinkers in the integralist position probably fully realize that their ideal can't become
Can you give an example, though, of like a piece we took from it that helped us?
From integralism?
Yeah, neither of us are integralists, but let's just use that as an example. Like, what in their thought experiment is helpful?
I think the critique of our existing order is more helpful than their solution. So when they talk about like what the secularism has wrought on people's like souls and their relationships, they're on.
I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think that is very helpful. It also strikes me that's not integralism, though, because integralism is the thing that would replace it. You know what I mean? But I do think that their critique is useful. Yeah.
Well, I don't agree with the idea that the church should run the state, but for fairly pragmatic reasons, right? So if the stars could align and everybody could be Orthodox Catholics in the way that an integralist thinks they should, then maybe that would work, but it doesn't work. But I don't get very frustrated with people doing that, especially theorists. That's kind of their job, right? Like their job is to believe in their ideas and to propose those ideas. And then it's the rest of our jobs to take those ideas and use them for what they're actually worth and to keep what works and throw away the rest. But without those ideals, we wouldn't be able to move forward. We wouldn't be able to think. We'd just be sort of relativists that just accepted whatever is. Nobody wants to do that, right? So I
agree. I think there's two great dangers, though. And one example is, I think part of the reason why our civilization has been successful and we have all this like you said, there's problems with our civilization and there's risks to our civilization. But part of the thing that's been so successful is that it's not centrally planned. Like when we've had centrally planned economies, we end up having a famine, and this dispersed planning has made this complex economy, society, political structure that's almost beyond anyone imagining. It's almost like if you have the kind of guts of a Lenin and say, actually, I could make it better than the way it grew up, you end up with like a tragedy, And I don't see integralists or the modern kind of what I think of as almost like utopian visionary. It's like doing what Lenin did. But I do see that, like, I'm seeing Catholics who have a long way to go to merely understand what it means to love your neighbor and to love others as God loves you, and how that's lived both in family and at your parish and with the poor and all these things. And it's very much like a personal request that works in the Roman Empire, in Nazi Germany, in America, and all these different things. And it's almost like a psychological and spiritual rebirth. I see that as the great work of Christianity. And yet I see really smart, principled Catholics spend a lot of time on something like integralism. And I think it's dangerous. And then I also think it's a little bit playing God the way Lenin played God. And I think that's almost goes from just being like a waste of time dangerous to like sinful dangerous. And that's where my like kind of critique is coming. And having said that, I am, I guess, an idealist. I'm sorry, I do believe there are many ideals we could have without thinking that you can reimagine all society as like the ideal.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't mean to beat you up on this. I'm just trying to get feedback from someone who knows.
Yeah. But like, I'm not worried about integralists because they're such a tiny little, minority of people that have no chance of ever, affecting any change whatsoever. So yes, their ideas might, if they could be like somehow brought into reality, might be indeed scary. We might have the Inquisitor all over again, right? Probably would. I mean, that's why they bother me, is I see that impulse that you're talking about in their writings. And yes, they should like focus on maybe other things, but I'm not worried about them because they really are obscure and completely irrelevant.
I'm not worried about them as a political movement, but a lot of my best Catholic friends think about it a lot. You know what I mean? And I'm like, we could like build the parish with that energy. You know what I mean? Like that's not the right thing to be, running your mind on. Like if it was one academic somewhere, okay,
But yeah, I think it's good to challenge them. But in the grander scheme of things, they're no threat to society.
Well, you're right. They're no threat to society. They're
And
just,
as a political scientist, I'm always thinking about that. Like like from my perspective, both like liberal cancel culture professors as well as these integralists are such minor players in the scheme of things. I don't understand why we focus on them, like, but yes, like when you're trying to deal with them to get them to do something, heck yes. Like it's a kind of, I don't know, what do I say, like a syndrome. This is partly what my book Ideological Possession was about, was,
wow.
just you become kind of possessed by these ideas, and then you're kind of disconnected from the real world at that point, and you can't, yeah.
So these ideas don't really have a virality that threatens our civilization. But what I see is like, so I deal with a lot of young people who want to be missionaries, right? And by a lot, I mean like 8 a year, and, we work together. They are missionaries. I get a chance to talk to them and form them as missionaries, right? And what I see is that's unbelievable. And the good one person can do, and just helping other people's faith, including their own family and their parish and all that. And maybe the way that I hope they go on from Simple House to keep doing that for the rest of their life. Love it, right? Great. Well, you know what I see the devil do is not tempt people to like lose their faith, or to become complete jerks. He tempts people to become scrupulous.
Yes.
Or tempts them to become, obsessed with something that's actually not God. You know what I mean? Like an integralist idea, something like that, something that's not useful. Like a scrupulosity is almost inherently just an unuseful guilt that they're dealing with all the time. Yeah. And it takes them out of commission. It really takes them from being like in the life of the church, building it up, to sidelined.
It totally does. And it's basically the same phenomenon as the red and blue sniping back and forth. Most right. Americans are unhealthily caught up in their like political party politics at a very kind of superficial, but still like psychologically satisfying level. And
right.
And it's also the problem of the Pharisees, right? Like from long ago, just the folks that are just so hung up on the rules and the structure that they can't practice. They can't actually get down to business and live it. Yeah. And it's annoying. I don't know how you combat that other than just trying to like jostle them back into reality, and to a certain extent apply some shame, so what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? But I don't know, like it's a really hard problem.
The line I kind of come up with is when somebody says that they're an integralist, it's like, do you think we need about 70% of society to be Catholic before we could consider that?
Yeah, at least.
Like really Catholic, not kind of Catholic, but really Catholic. And they'll be like, yeah, I think so. And it's like, okay, let's just work on how to get to that.
Right. Yeah.
Or the other one I like is when they say they're distributists. It's like, how many people are you willing to kill to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because that's about what it takes. Yeah.
Right. And in that idea, I mean, that could inform policy, just right. Just like capitalist ideology has informed policy, so could distributists. Doesn't mean though that we'd want to somehow transform the entire country into this overnight. But I mean, our Friedman, style liberal economics informed our policy. That theory, which is just every bit as utopian as distributism, has informed our economic policy for decades. And one could argue it's completely, it's delusional. We never have had a free market. What does that even mean? Politics has always intersected with our market, but we believe that it's a free market. And we've made all sorts of policies that have basically amounted to neoliberal fragmentation of our public services on the basis of this theory. So we've already done it. So, when we look at somebody like the distributists who are like, but we have a nerdy theory too, like it seems a little bit like we have to be a little charitable, I guess. And I guess I do distinguish between the distributists and the integralists as far as like the usefulness of the theory.
Well, I do have like some anarchists and a libertarian thinker that I follow that like I find like if I was president, I would have them in my office once every 2 weeks to comment on every policy, because I find their commentary often very good. But as soon as they start telling me their vision for all of society, I'm like, oh, give me a break. You know what I mean? Like, you guys can go away, But I think that could be true of a distributist, because I do like the general principle. The thing, though, about this like free market stuff that like Milton Friedman represents is there are powers and incentives behind it that make it politically like viral in a sense, like it like really push it forward, because there's groups that would really benefit from that, whereas like when you get something good like distributism, it could be like, well, all society might benefit, but no one benefits enough individually to push it hard enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and then I get kind of hopeless.
Labor union, like that's why
right.
We can't do that anymore either. It's just not enough in the person's immediate self-interest. And it's
also why some labor unions get co-opted by mafia, because they figured out a way to make it super profitable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know what the answer is here, but I tend to think that those ideas are healthy for our society, including integralism. As a professor, I think that we need to have an open discussion of all ideas and then let people sort them out. I guess I'm a liberal to that extent. I do believe in the free marketplace of ideas. And I think that that's partly how we've gotten this vibrant, economy, to the extent that it's good, that we have, is by people being free to do that. And one thing I see now is a lot of people wanting to shut other people down, right? Like, don't want you to, talk about this or that theory, particularly like whether, like some people, if they see the word Marx, become practically, they get the hives, like when I was educated a Straussian. Every one of my professors, I had one conservative Catholic and two other political theory professors who were neocons. Okay. But I took a class on Marx when I was in grad school that was taught by one of the neocons. Why? Because he thought we needed to know about it and we needed to understand it, and that certain elements of it were actually somewhat worth, incorporating into our own way of thinking. And so this is, another kind of disturbing trend I see in our society, is we're so like religious about our ideas, that we want to exclude anybody who doesn't agree with us. That kind of goes down another rabbit hole, but that's really kind of bothering me right now.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Laurie, before we call this a podcast?
I don't know, just like encourage people to check out the Maurin Academy. It's Maurin, PMAURIN.org, if you want to look at our website. And we have a Patreon, so, join us on Patreon and support our activities that way. We've got a class coming up on Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America that Spencer and I are going to be doing together in, I want to say, September, might be October, I can't remember, but it's on our calendar. And we have a lot of things going on, including a communio reading group, which is right now reading Schindler's Heart of the World, Center of the Church. That's our first book. So anyway, check us out and hopefully support what we do.
Well, Dr. Laurie Johnson, I want to say that I really admire you. I admire you because I've just seen a lot how you engaged you are with students, and even just being part of this Catholic Worker Farm of a former student. And I just am very impressed by all that. I'm very impressed with your willingness to have conversations and get out there on the internet. And also, I love that you and Spencer, although you are idealists and value that, really also value just testing those ideas on reality. And I just think that's wonderful. I really want to thank you for being on our show.
Thank you. And I appreciate what you do as well with Simple House. It's really amazing. So appreciate your time.
All right. God bless. Thank you, Dr. Laurie.